the whole system of the airline sector. And how long will it last? That's a good question. We don't know.
Frédéric Dimanche, thank you so much for making the time on this Saturday. The Prime Minister is just out, so I'll let you go. Thank you so much. Here is the Prime Minister of Canada.
It's the International Day against homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. Every year, this is a day where we speak out against the stigma, discrimination, and violence that target the LGBTQ2 community. We need to show our solidarity tomorrow and every day. Homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia are never okay. We all have a role to play in building a Canada where everyone can be proud of who they are and whom they love. Peu importe où vous vivez,
wherever you live or what you do in life, your life has changed because of the pandemic. Your needs, your concerns, and your challenges are not the same as before because your situation is not the same either. Our government, therefore, introduced new programs to help us to get through this crisis, whether you're studying or retiring, with or without a job. At the same time, we are planning to provide more support to organizations whose work is even more critical these days.
I want to start with some news on the medical front. Health Canada has now approved the first Canadian clinical trials for a potential COVID-19 vaccine at the Canadian Centre for Vaccinology at Dalhousie University. The National Research Council of Canada will be working with the manufacturers so that if these vaccine trials are successful, we can produce and distribute it here at home. Research and development take time and must be done right, but this is encouraging news. A few weeks ago, we announced $40 million for women's shelters and sexual assault centres across the country. And for Indigenous women and children fleeing violence, we're providing $10 million for emergency shelters. Our goal was to help these organizations take all the necessary steps to protect people not only from violence, but from COVID-19. To date, more than 500 women's shelters and sexual assault organizations have received additional support, including Inasmuch House in Hamilton, the Miramichi Emergency Centre for Women, the Saskatoon Interval House, and the South Okanagan Women in Need Society.
Community organizations such as shelters for women are a critical resource for the most vulnerable. And during the pandemic, their mission does not change. On the contrary, they are serving a larger clientele and must adapt to the realities of this pandemic. We therefore introduced an emergency fund that now has an envelope of $350 million. Most of that money will be distributed through various community organizations such as the Red Cross and United Way. The details with respect to the registration process will be published on our partner associations' websites. But organizations that need that support will be able to apply starting on Tuesday.
I now want to turn to what we're doing for parents. As you've probably heard, we're boosting the Canada Child Benefit for the month of May. You can expect to receive $300 more per child when you get your benefit this Wednesday. But that's not all. Starting on July 20th, we will increase the Canada Child Benefit once again for the upcoming year. Every summer for the past 3 years, we boosted the CCB to help keep up with the cost of living. And this summer will be no different. As the price of your groceries go up, so will the benefit.
We are already providing for targeted measures for students and parents because we are aware that these are the groups that are facing particular challenges because of the pandemic. But of course, there are still people we need to support. I'm thinking of women who are owners of their own businesses, who have suffered a disproportionate effect of the pandemic. Many have small businesses and are having problems with liquidity. Others work in sectors that are totally paralyzed because of COVID-19, such as restaurants and hotels. Now, the obstacles associated with this pandemic are added to the number of obstacles women often face, such as gender-based discrimination. In order to help those women during this crisis, our government will be investing $15 million in a new strategy for women entrepreneurs.
From the outset, our number one priority has always been to protect the health and safety of Canadians. And we've been able to count on the Canadian Red Cross to do just that. They've been playing a key role in supporting Canadians during this crisis, helping both individuals and communities with their most pressing needs. But like many organizations, the Red Cross is facing an increased demand for its services at a time where they are getting fewer volunteers and receiving less in donations. So today, our government is investing $100 million to ensure that the Red Cross can keep responding to COVID-19 while also preparing for potential floods and wildfires.
I just want to close this morning by talking to the children and young people listening today. I know that the last few weeks have not been easy for you. You're anxious to see your friends and return to school, and yes, to have a break from your parents. For the teenagers who are members of the LGBTQ community, I know it's even more difficult. It's difficult at home, but I know as well that you're far from your support networks. But we will continue to be there for you. And I know that together we will come through this. Slowly, things will start to get better. So do continue to do your best at home and help your parents, because at the same time, that helps us to get through this as a society. Stay strong, and we will see each other on the other side. Thank you all very much.
We'll now go to the phones for questions. One question, one follow-up. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. For questions, star 1. Pour des questions, étoile 1. First question, Teresa Wright, the Canadian Press. Line open.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Over the last several weeks, you have made comments suggesting help for the airline industry was coming. Now Air Canada is laying off more than half its workforce. Will specific help be coming for Air Canada and the airline industry as a whole, and how will it help the workers affected by these layoffs?
We moved forward quickly on support for people who got laid off, and then moved forward on a wage subsidy that has been drawn on by Air Canada and other airlines in order to support people across this country who, because, as you say, the airline industry is extremely affected by COVID-19, there hasn't been the work for them. We're going to continue to work with airlines across this country and make sure that they are drawing on the benefit packages that we put forward for workers through the wage subsidy. But we've also moved forward on a LEAF program for large employers, as well as looking at sectoral supports. We will continue to work directly with big employers across this country and various sectors and make sure that they have the support so we can all come roaring back once this pandemic is through.
And a follow-up, Teresa?
Thank you. You mentioned that Air Canada was using the wage subsidy, but this clearly hasn't been enough to keep employees on the payroll. Uptake on the wage subsidy program has been low overall. What is this telling you about the help that will be needed for businesses over the longer term?
I think one of the things that businesses need is confidence to know that we are going to be there. And just about every day I come out and reassure people that the government will be there to support businesses, to support workers, to support families through this difficult situation. We just announced on Friday that we will be extending the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy until the end of the summer in order to make sure that companies can rehire people, keep them on their payroll, because we know that the best way to bring the economy back quickly and efficiently is if people continue to have that link with their employer, even as we go through the containment measures we have to. Nous savons que c'est un grand défi
We
pour
know
les
that it's a major
compagnies
challenge
aériennes,
now for large companies, including the airline sector, when it comes to supporting their employees. And that's why we introduced the wage subsidy And that's why we have been working with various companies across the country to support them. We know there's more that needs to be done, and we had the certainty behind that, and it was the reason why we extended the wage study. And we will continue to ensure that people can keep their attachment to their employer so that we can return quickly once this pandemic is over.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Mélanie Marquis, La Presse. À vous.
Merci. Bonjour, Monsieur.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. The fact that 20,000 people are being laid off at Air Canada, what does that say to you about the wage subsidy? Do you think more needs to be done? And could the government again nationalize Air Canada as has been done in the aerospace sector? Well, we know that this is an extremely challenging situation now for airline companies, and that's why we introduced measures across the economy to support workers, including in the airline industry. We will be working closely with companies like Air Canada to see what more we can do to support them.
I think we all know that this pandemic has hit extremely hard on travel industries and on the airlines particularly. That's why we're going to keep working with airlines, including Air Canada, to see how we can help even more than we have with the wage subsidy.
Follow up?
Oui, juste pour revenir sur la question de la nationalisation.
Just coming back to the idea of nationalization, have you ruled out the possibility of nationalizing Air Canada? And could there be a bailout for this company? Well, we will be working with lots of different sectors and lots of companies to ensure that they can come through this pandemic, and we'll be talking to Air Canada and other airlines as well to see what the options are to support the tens of thousands of workers who are part of their workforce.
Ashley Burke, CBC News. Good morning. The wage subsidy and the bridge loans, they were not enough to prevent Air Canada from planning these major cuts. What does that tell you about the future of this industry in particular and the effectiveness of these programs? And is it possible that some might not survive regardless of government support?
This is a pandemic that has hit extremely hard in all sectors of the economy, and it is something that we are all trying to figure out how to get through the best possible way. But certain sectors have been hit even harder. Obviously, tourism, airlines are the kinds of things that people simply are not drawing on right now. That's why we're going to keep working with various sectors, keep working with specific companies to try and see what the best way through of supporting workers who depend on those industries for their livelihoods, but also look at how we can make sure that Canada comes through this intact and even in a good position for the future. We will
continue to work with the sectors and industries that have been very hard hit by this pandemic. We will do everything we can to ensure that Canada can come out of this situation in good shape, and we will always be seeking to support workers and families across the country.
MPs has said in writing to a member of the public that there will not be a bailout for the airline industry coming. Is he right?
We're going to continue to work with sectors and industries to try and support them as they get through this pandemic. We put in place the large enterprise emergency finance facility, LEAF, to be able to support companies with liquidity over this time of the pandemic. It is not a bailout; it is a loan that is going to help them get through. But we are still working with companies to see who's taking that up and how those the format of it will be worked out. Okay. Nous avons mis en place de l'aide du crédit additionnel.
Provided additional credit and made that available to employers, and we will be working with different companies, perhaps airlines as well, to offer more liquidity to them in these difficult times. Christian Noël, Radio-Canada. cities. Cities are pretty much in a difficult position because they're being asked to help with the healthcare community, but things are not doing well. They have less revenues coming in. Now, are you aware of this? Have you discussed this with the provinces? And what can you do? Well, I had my 9th discussion with the premiers on Thursday evening, and we talked about the circumstances which are particularly difficult for our cities and municipalities as a result of this crisis. They provide a lot of services to citizens, but they're seeing their revenues decline drastically. So obviously, we respect the fact that Canadian cities are a provincial responsibility. We have no intention of interfering in that responsibility, but we have said to the provinces that we want to be there to support them so that we can help the provinces to ensure that the cities remain healthy.
I think we talked directly about this on Thursday evening in my First Minister's meeting, the 9th of this pandemic, with the premiers, where I highlighted my concerns that Canada's big cities and indeed municipalities of all sizes across the country are facing significant challenges as they continue to deliver services in difficult situations for their citizens, while at the same time seeing massive drops in revenue. We respect, of course, and we know that cities are the responsibility of the provinces, but I highlighted that the federal government is eager to hear from the provinces how we can support cities. It has been very important for me as Prime Minister over these past 5 years to be supportive of our cities, and we're continuing to look to do so, but recognize the provincial jurisdiction in this.
Deux choses en suivi. Est-ce que vous êtes en train de dire que
First of all, are you saying that the help that could be given to the cities is slower now because you can't agree on that with them? And also, they need support now. There are cities that have already had to lay off municipal employees, and cities like Edmonton that are thinking of reducing their public transit services as a result of this. So, one, will you talk to the cities so that they can get that help quickly? And will they be able to get it as early as this summer? Well, as I said, we have discussed this already, and all of us, the premiers and myself, all agree that we have to support the cities. The federal government will be there as a partner to support the provinces in the work that they have to now carry out to support their cities.
We all agree across First Ministers that we need to do more to support cities, and I have assured them that the federal government will be there to support the cities in what they choose to do, what they need to do, support the provinces in what they need to do to support cities.
Hi, Prime Minister. Crystal Logue with Global News. Beyond the wage subsidy and already announced programs, will there be any industry-specific supports for smaller airlines in Canada that don't meet certain thresholds for support?
We've put in place a support for sectors and large employers, and that is something that we're moving forward on. Industry Canada is engaged closely with various sectors. We recognize that certain areas are harder hit than others. Airlines is a great example of something that was going well before the pandemic, where we are going to need airlines afterwards. We need to make sure we can support them through in the right way that makes sense for Canadians, and that's what we'll do.
But will there be any specific supports for this industry?
As I said, we're working with the industry, we're working with sectors to see what kind of supports would be right, both for Canada and for them.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Mackenzie Greer with CTV. Air Canada right now is losing about $1 million an hour. They lost $1 billion last quarter. They're only flying about 5% of their flights they're using. And now that they're laying off about half their staff and are choosing not to use the wage subsidy. You said before that Canada needs to have a strong airline sector after this. So if that's the case, is the federal government willing to take an equity stake in Air Canada to make sure that they stay alive?
We will have conversations with Air Canada, as we will with airlines across the sector, to try and see how the best way to get through this particular pandemic is. We know that airlines are incredibly hard hit by this pandemic, and we will be there to work with them to see how best we can help.
One of the things that Well, one of the things that Air Canada mentioned is that, yes, we can get the wage subsidy from the federal government, but the major issue for them financially was the fact that they had to still pay their pension and health benefits out. Is the federal government considering any additional changes to the wage subsidy that would include these programs to allow larger businesses to still keep people employed?
We're going to work with large businesses like Air Canada to ensure that workers, employees, pensioners are protected during the situation. Our focus will always be on supporting Canadians and their families. That's what we're going to talk with industry and companies about.
We will always ensure that we are supporting workers, retirees, and companies in Canada. That's our priority. And that's what we will be discussing with the various companies out there who need help. What can you say to families about how quickly they will be receiving that? We will be increasing the Canada Child Benefit. We know that families are facing additional hardship, and starting next Wednesday, you will be receiving $300 more per child through the Canada Child Benefit. Furthermore, in July, as we have done every year in the last 3 years, we will be again increasing the child benefit to ensure it keeps pace with the cost of living so that you can pay for whatever your family needs. We have always supported families and will continue to do so. Thank you all very much.
All right, that is the Prime Minister of Canada on this Saturday of the long weekend. We are not expecting briefings from the Prime Minister Sunday or Monday. So this is the last time we'll hear from him over the course of the long weekend. A couple of bits of news in what he had to say today, so I'll bring in my colleague David Cochran to help me with that. I'll start perhaps with the encouraging news, David, that they have, Health Canada has authorized a clinical trial for a possible vaccine at the University at Dalhousie University. So that would be a first in Canada at any rate. We know that there's about 100 or so vaccines on the go in the world, but that would be a first clinical trial for this country. Let's go to the Air Canada move, though, because there was a lot of questions, obviously, about that.
Yeah, a lot of questions on that, and not necessarily a tremendous amount of answers at this point in time, except that the Government of Canada will work with Air Canada specifically and the industry more broadly to see what things they might be able to do to help that particularly challenged sector. I mean, the Prime Minister was asked everything as to what this says about the effectiveness of the programs they've rolled out and whether or not they consider expanding federal aid to do things like cover pension and benefit obligations for large companies, maybe even taking an equity stake in a struggling company like Air Canada. Nothing ruled out, nothing ruled in. I think it would be difficult for the government to take on the pension and benefits obligations for large-scale industry in this country when it's already agreed to take on a significant portion of the wages of large-scale and small-scale business in this country. But the word of the age is unprecedented, Rosie. So why rule anything out when it is a possibility, if it's a choice between Air Canada going under or drastically downsizing to a fraction of what it was going into this? The government may have to look at some very specific options, much like the other issue that he was asked about in terms of like helping cities. I mean, as we go through these daily question and answer sessions with the Prime Minister, you can just see the sheer scope and scale of the challenge that from an individual Canadian all the way up to the top of the corporate suites of the business world in Canada, what they're facing. I mean, you have airlines laying off more than 50% of their staff. 45% of the Canadian workforce is on some sort of direct government aid, either through the emergency response benefit or the wage subsidy. You have cities, many of whom are restricted from legislation, from running deficits and going into debt, crying out for enormous financial help. Major transit services that run municipally and provincially having to scale back and cut their level of services. And all of these people, from provincial governments to industry to municipal governments to public agencies, are looking at one level of government, the federal government, for help because it has the best balance sheet in the country and the most fiscal room to maneuver. But that room gets gobbled up really, really quickly as you go through these announcements on the expansion of everything from child benefits to wage subsidies for companies.
I will say that was the first I had heard him at least acknowledge that the federal government is eager to hear ideas from provinces on how to bail out cities, because the cities this week in particular sort of ramped up the desperation, I think, for large cities in their pleas for some kind of support that they know very well will have to come via the federal government. I'll just go back to the Air Canada bailout idea. That too is very complicated, as you say, because if you decide that you have to bail out Air Canada, and you heard from my guest earlier that that would be something the federal government may have to do, then where do you sort of put the limit? What do you not bail out? What how do you explain to other big companies or industries that are being hard hit that they don't get a bailout? I mean, I think that once you open the door to that, it becomes extremely complicated for the government. And when they put that LEAF program in place, the large employer bridge financing program in place, I think that's what they were hoping, was that would be enough, that they didn't have to get into the business of bailing people out.
Yeah, and it gets more complex, I think, the bigger the company is. I mean, you look at the small business aid package that was out there. The wage subsidy there, the big tweak that was made to that was that they would remit CPP and EI premiums that a small business might have to pay for hiring people back, to make it as cost neutral as possible. That's an easy fix for small businesses who don't have defined benefit or defined contribution pension plans, or even like broad health benefits plans. The bigger the company gets, the more those obligations get complicated and far more expensive, and it becomes a big ask to get the federal government to cover those. So this becomes the challenges that are there. I mean, Air Canada undoubtedly is a strategically important company for this country. So is WestJet. So Air Canada, though it's much larger and has a bigger international footprint, the challenges they face are just astronomical right now, because there is nothing but uncertainty in the world. I mean, we had the great news off the top that researchers at Dalhousie, they have approval to start clinical trials. But clinical trials is a long way from a vaccine, which is a long way from the manufacturing of a vaccine, which is a long way from the vaccination of the population to a level to get herd immunity. And until you get to these sorts of things, the fundamental questions of what happens with companies like Air Canada can't be answered.
Okay, David, I'll leave it there with you for a little bit, but I'll come back to you if you don't mind. And I'll leave people with this note too. Today, Air Canada crossed the threshold of the 75,000 COVID cases in this country. But the good news is there are now more recovered cases than active ones. So keep that in mind. So while the airline industry is hoping the federal government will perhaps provide some more support as they move forward, there's another sector looking to stay afloat during this pandemic. New Brunswick lobster season is underway, but this year the shortage of temporary foreign workers in that province has left a worrying labor gap. That gap is forcing some seafood plants to take a different approach and hire students. Coming up, we'll speak to a father and son who will be working side by side this summer, right after this break. Hi, welcome back. In New Brunswick, lobster season is underway, but this year the shortage of temporary foreign workers has left a bit of a labor gap. So the province did hold a virtual job fair, but some fisheries and processing plants found it didn't help. In an effort to fill in lost labor, some seafood plants are turning to students to help process lobsters. Russell Jacob is the owner of Westmoreland Fisheries in Cap Pellet, and he's also working at the plant with his son there. That's Zachary beside him. Good to see you both.
Hi, nice to see you too.
Hi, Russell, let's start with you. So the province held a job fair, and what was the outcome?
Disastrous. It was a virtual job fair, and it was really hard to understand how to get through to the job postings. First, you had to create an account, and I tried myself. It's very, very confusing, and I've had people also check as well, and they said the same thing. And we had one applicant, and the person was from Mexico, so it's not efficient at all, and with no results, zero results.
So normally, where would your labor come from at this time of year?
Well, we have many local employees. We have between 150 to 200 local employees. And we also have between 150 to 200 foreign workers, depending on the year, how busy we are. And most of them come from Mexico. We have Filipinos, Jamaicans, Indonesia, Sri Lankans. They've been here for many years, and they're part of the family, right?
And what happened this year? That they weren't allowed to come in? You couldn't get them? What was the complication?
They were disallowed by our provincial government. They put a ban on TFWs crossing the border.
And what did you think of that? Because we know that other temporary foreign workers have been allowed in other parts of the country, in Quebec, Ontario, to help with farming. I think there's about 11,000 that have been allowed into the country. What do you make of your province's decision to not allow that?
Very upsetting, and very discouraged that our own provincial government pulled the fast one on us at the last minute too. So with no warning signs at all. Right, our neighbors, Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, their government are actually embraced the foreign workers to save their manufacturers, the fishing industries and the farming industry. The PEI government, Nova Scotia government, took charge, and they took possession of the foreign workers as soon as they came in the province. Mm-hmm. They put them in hotels, and they did their quarantining there with security, and they had meal plans and everything. And after their quarantine, they are delivered to the plants to be able to work and help out, right?
So Zachary is not just sitting there for his 5 minutes of fame. He's sitting there because you've hired your son to help you in the plant because you're down workers. So maybe I'll start asking Zachary. How old are you again, Zachary?
13.
You're 13. That's young to have a job like that. How when your dad said, "I need some help," what did you say to him?
I said yes, and I wanted to come here before, and he said, "Well, I need help," so I go help him.
And do you know how to do the work?
Yes.
You do? Is he paying you?
Yep.
Oh, that's good. So Russell, obviously your son, it's fairly easy to hire him, and it sounds like he was interested in the business anyway, but you've tried to get other students on board. Can you tell me about that?
Actually, surprisingly, I didn't need to try. The word got around that Zachary was working here, and they started applying. We have, today we had around 10 teenagers, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. Tomorrow, there's about 7 more adding to that.
Wow.
And Monday we'll add more. We had about 40 to 50 applicants from the teenagers. We had zero applicants from the virtual job fair, but at least the local kids are are stepping up to the plate, and they're really, I must say, my hats off to them. They're really, really helping out.
That's great. I mean, I guess Zachary's familiar with the business a little bit, but our teens, can they do this work? How hard is it to train them?
Well, this morning, we're a bit nervous, but you know what? They surprised us. Very, very surprisingly. They caught on to work. We'll have them do different kind of jobs through their work term here. And so we don't want them to get bored. We want them to love it as much as possible and show up every day. And but no, it went very, very well this morning. Kids surprised me and eager to learn, and we will probably learn more from them that they'll learn from us, right? So
yeah, are you surprised that this is working? That you've come up with this? I mean, that's one of the things about this whole pandemic is people coming up with really creative ideas to solve solutions, and this is one of them. Were you surprised by that?
Yeah, I didn't expect it, but just so we're clear. No, they're not going to replace our foreign workers that we have here experience. We're gonna be affected. We're gonna be our efficiency will be down by a lot. So our capacity will most likely be down by 50%, and it's going to be a bit chaotic in the next weeks to come if there's a lot of lobsters being landed.
The government did offer a couple weeks back $62 million for processing plants, so that you could buy, personal protective equipment or extra freezer room. Have you tapped into any of that support?
Not yet. No, we've paid all for the PPEs ourselves. We have our own freezer here, and we use other freezers. But the federal government has been a big help so far, and. We're trying to get through the season. Yeah.
And Zachary, have you convinced any of your buddies to get on board and get a job too?
Yeah, well, I told them and they were like, yeah, come. Like, I told them and they wanted to come too.
Yeah, that's good. I'm impressed. I don't know that I could do that work, so I'm very impressed that you wanted to help your dad out, and I'm glad you're getting paid.
Yeah.
Okay, Russell and Zachary Jacob, merci beaucoup, j'apprécie. They are the owner of Westmoreland Fisheries, and we reached them in Cap Pelé, New Brunswick. Merci, thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, I'll bring back David Cochrane just as we wait for the noon briefing to begin with some federal cabinet ministers and public health officials. See, you can get your kids doing your work if you pay them, and they can get their buddies helping out too.
I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old with a lot of energy who are going a little bit house crazy. I'd be happy to send to the plant in New Brunswick.
To New Brunswick.
If Premier Higgs will let us cross the border, I will drop them off tomorrow.
Yeah, he probably won't, unfortunately. I'll just bring people up to speed on a couple of other things that they should know out of the Prime Minister's briefing there. The Canada Child Benefit, which we knew was going to get that extra $300 bump. He also confirmed that it is going up as it does annually, in case people were concerned about that, because I know a lot of people rely on that in their families, and it does obviously increase each year. The other thing that happened yesterday, David, was the student aid being opened up for people as well, and I have had some tweets already that it seems to be going fairly smoothly for them as well.
Yeah, every week it seems another new multi-billion-dollar aid package comes online, and credit to the federal public service, not necessarily on the design of the programs, but in the administration of them. The internet portals, we said at the very beginning of this pandemic, Rosie, that the rollout of all of these aid programs would be a real test for the IT systems of the government, and to this point, that has not been a problem. There have been problems with the programs. People getting money they shouldn't get, people getting double payments, people getting underpayments, that sort of stuff that they need to work out in terms of design and administration. But to this point, at least, the IT systems have held, and people have been able to get the money in their pocket. The political haggling over the student aid program, though, will be an interesting one to see. There is an insistence from some quarters that to get this money, you have to be willing to go take some jobs in sectors like agriculture or wherever. Whether that comes to pass, and how it is tracked, and how it can be demonstrated, and whether it's enough to satisfy the people who want that as a condition of help.
Okay, David, I'll leave it there just for a moment if you don't mind. We're going to take a short break here on CBC News Network. When we come back at the top of the hour, we will go to the federal briefing with cabinet ministers and public health officials for the very latest on federal aid during this pandemic. I'm Rosemary Barton. You're watching CBC News Network. Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton here in the nation's capital. Thanks for joining us on CBC News Network and streaming wherever you might be on our website and our CBC News app. We are standing by to hear from federal cabinet ministers on the announcements that the Prime Minister made about 45 minutes ago. They are expected to give us more details that the Prime Minister hinted at earlier. For instance, that Health Canada has approved the first Canadian clinical trials for a potential COVID-19 vaccine. That news comes as the scale of the pandemic here continues to grow. We are now tracking a total number of confirmed cases in Canada of more than 75,000, although, as I indicated earlier, recovered cases are now more than the active cases, people who have recovered from the virus. And as you know, in different parts of the country on this long weekend, there are things that you can do that you weren't able to do many weekends ago. And part of that is happening in Ontario. It is one of the provinces that is very slowly lifting some of those public health restrictions because of the high number of cases still in this province. Part of a plan by the Premier Doug Ford to try and restart the economy in different ways. So there are new guidelines in place on golf courses to maximize physical distancing and limit contact points where the virus could be passed on. For more on today's reopening, I'm joined by Brian Decker. He's the marketing director at TPC Toronto at Osprey Valley. And that is a golf course just outside of Toronto, which is behind him. Good to see you, Brian.
Hi, Rosemary. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm good. So I'm not a golfer myself, but I know many people who were anxiously awaiting this day because they said to themselves, well, this seems like something I should be able to do and still follow physical distancing restrictions, requirements. So how have you adapted to make sure people can do that?
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time putting a detailed plan together on what it looks like from the moment people arrive on property until the moment they leave. And that includes their whole golf experience, because we want the expectations to be clear that we need people to kind of be in this together, and everyone has a role to play to bring this back into our lives safely. And thankfully, we were able to put a plan together in advance. And once the government allowed us to, gave us notice that we could open starting on Saturday, we were relatively well planned to go ahead with that. And it's really just about communicating clearly and managing expectations, and really the attitude of we're all in this together.
How busy is it there today?
Well, we filled out all of the tee times for this weekend within a few minutes of, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. It's one of the hazards of being outside.
It's our first wind of the day. I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
Our tee times filled out within a matter of minutes. Mm-hmm. And that's because we have fewer tee times than we normally would. We have about 20% capacity of what we would normally have for a long weekend, because we wanted to make sure we could do this safely first. That was the priority from the get-go, was making sure that, we want to make sure we get off the ground running. We can do this with, safe operations, and not try to, put the cart before the horse and get ahead of ourselves, and make sure that everybody's safe when they get here.
What I know a lot of people were asking or thinking about what you would do with the actual hole after you sink a putt. Have you had to adapt that? Because obviously that is could be a source of transmission.
Yeah, the government provided some suggestions and best practices for what to do. A lot of courses have used a pool noodle or a raised cup. We have a system called the pin caddy, which allows the ball to pop out of the hole once it goes in without golfers having to touch the flagstick or put their hand anywhere near the hole. So we were able to test that, and we feel that it's a good, safe system for people to use. But everyone's doing things a little bit differently, because the golf courses have been given, some may call it a responsibility, some may call it an opportunity. But everyone's been, put in a position where we've got a lot of responsibility to try to make sure we do this right. And everyone's doing things a little bit differently based on the best practices that were outlined by the government.
Okay, Brian Decker, good of you to make the time and do that outside for us, even with the gusts of wind. I hope the weekend goes well. You're one of the first kind of businesses out there reopening, so you'll be a good test for everybody. Appreciate your time today.
Great. Thanks, Rosemary.
Okay, that's Brian Decker with the golfers TPC Toronto at Osprey Valley in Caledon, Ontario. It looks like a beautiful day out there. All right, let's take you to the federal briefing now here in Ottawa with federal cabinet ministers. This is Minister Hussen. Let's listen.
That is why we also announced recently the Emergency Community Support Fund in the amount of $350 million in assistance to nonprofits and the charitable sector organizations that support the most vulnerable in our communities. I'm happy to announce today that starting on May 19th, community-based organizations that require financial assistance to reorient their services to vulnerable Canadians during the pandemic will be able to apply for funding through our partner organizations. The Government of Canada is pleased to work hand in hand with the United Way Centraide Canada, the Canadian Red Cross, and the Community Foundations of Canada. Our partners will post information on eligibility criteria and how organizations can apply for this funding on Tuesday, May 19th. While we remain focused on helping Canadians through this pandemic, the Government of Canada also recognizes that there are also additional challenges faced by vulnerable Canadians, including African and Black Canadians. Also, in recognition of Canada's commitment to the United Nations Decade for People of African Descent, I'm also proud to announce that the Government of Canada is moving ahead with the investment of up to $25 million over 4 years in assistance to Black Canadian community organizations, including $5 million in capital assistance. Later this spring, we will share details on how these organizations can apply for grants to build the necessary capacity and infrastructure to better serve Black Canadian communities. We will then work with the Network for the Advancement of Black Canadians, Tropi-Canada Community Services, as well as the Black Business Initiative and Le Groupe 3737 to disperse these investments before the end of 2020. Canadian charities and nonprofit organizations have always stepped up to help the most vulnerable in our communities. Even in the most challenging of circumstances, they have continued to help the most vulnerable in our communities. Now is the time for us to help them in return. We have your backs. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. On va maintenant passer la parole à la Ministre Monsef. We'll now hear from Minister Monsef.
Merci. Bonjour, Ani. Salam alaikum to Muslims
Thank you.
observing Ramadan. COVID has hit women hardest, with jobs lost, with additional unpaid care responsibilities for their kids or elders. Women are the majority of those on the front lines of the crisis. Personal support workers, childcare workers, food sector workers, nurses and healthcare workers, and social workers. The rates of domestic violence and gender-based violence were high pre-COVID, with a woman being killed by her intimate partner every 6 days in Canada. Because of isolation measures and the pressures people are experiencing, our partners on the front lines are telling us that the rates and the severity of the violence have increased. At the same time, some organizations are telling us that things are eerily quiet, particularly in more rural and isolated regions of our country. Some women are unable to seek help due to increased scrutiny and control and lack of access to friends, extended family, community centers, schools, places of worship. The pandemic doesn't make domestic violence stop. It just silences it. We may not be able to see it, but we know it is happening, making gender-based violence a shadow pandemic. Domestic violence, everywhere and always, is about inequality of power. When the powerful feel a loss of control, some become depressed, some snap, unleashing frustrations on those around them. Domestic violence is a universal phenomenon. It happens in rich and poor households, in rich and poor nations, in urban, rural, and remote settings. We understand that some women and children may not be aware that support organizations are open and ready to help. To ensure that these organizations are able to continue their critical work at this difficult time, our government announced $50 million to support them. $40 million of this is being delivered through my department, and $10 million is dedicated support for Indigenous organizations and will flow through Indigenous Services Canada. $23 million has been provided to Women's Shelters Canada and the Canadian Women's Foundation, who worked quickly and tirelessly to get money into the bank accounts of frontline organizations. We thank them for this work. Funding began to flow in April, and as of today, I can confirm that 422 women's shelters and 89 sexual assault organizations have received funding. We've reached a separate agreement with the government of Quebec that will see over $6 million in federal funding flow to frontline organizations in the province. Those funds were transferred to Quebec earlier this month. Organizations are using these funds to keep their doors open, pay their staff, purchase cleaning supplies and PPE, laptops and software to support clients remotely, protect workers, and allow for necessary physical distancing measures. As part of the $50 million that was previously announced, $10 million will be distributed to address gaps and support hundreds of other organizations. All eligible organizations will receive funding by early June. I will have more details to share on this in the coming days. So if you're experiencing violence at home, if your home is not a safe home for you or your children, you do not have to stay. I know you're afraid, but there are thousands of smart, caring professionals in every corner of this country who can help. Reach out to one directly or talk to someone you trust to discuss your options and plan your exit. Visit sheltersafe.ca for more resources. If you or someone you know is in immediate danger, call 911 or your local emergency services. There are also people answering crisis lines who can help you, even if you have only a few minutes to talk, including the Kids Helpline at 1-800-668-6868. If you can't speak on the phone, Signal for Help is a simple one-handed signal you can use on a video call. It can help you silently show you need help and want someone to check in with you in a safe way. It's been developed by the Canadian Women's Foundation. Put your thumb to the camera and tuck your thumb and then trap your thumb. If you see someone signaling for help like this, visit the Canadian Women's Foundation website to find out how you can help. Your health and safety is everyone's priority, from the virus and from those who may be threatening you. No one should have to live through violence, whether it be physical, psychological, financial, or sexual. These are difficult times, but the pandemic has also highlighted Canadians' tremendous capacity for social solidarity and shared sacrifice for one another. We will continue to be there for each other. Things will get better. We are deeply grateful to women's organizations and equality-seeking organizations across the country, providing services to vulnerable women and their children. They are providing critical supports, and we will continue to support them so that they can continue to be there for women and children in their hour of need. Merci.
Merci, Madame la Ministre. Thank you, Minister. We'll now hear from Minister Ng. Madame la Ministre.
Thank you. Thank you. Women business owners and entrepreneurs are being uniquely affected by COVID-19 right now. Women are more likely to be represented in sectors being severely affected by this crisis, like in retail, hospitality, and the service industries. Les entreprises sont généralement plus.
Their businesses are generally smaller and more vulnerable. And it is more difficult for them to seek support.
Most of the unpaid work within the home. And because of COVID-19, many are taking on even more of this work while trying to keep their businesses going. I want to take a moment to speak directly to women entrepreneurs all across our country. I know many of you are wearing so many different hats right now, and at a time that is incredibly challenging and uncertain. I want you to know that we see you, and we're doing everything we can to support you. Every single day, you make vital contributions to our communities and indeed to our Canadian economy. That's why years ago, our government established Canada's first ever women's entrepreneurship strategy. It's a $2 billion investment to increase women's access to funding, to networks, to expertise, so that they can succeed in the Canadian economy. And indeed, this investment actually totals closer to $5 billion when you include government-wide initiatives like financing for women-owned businesses looking to export globally. It is why, amid COVID-19, we're helping entrepreneurs pay their rent, keep their employees, boosting the Canada Child Benefit for parents, and increasing funding to address gender-based violence, and so much more. Aujourd'hui, nous soutenons encore plus les femmes entrepreneurs.
Today, we are supporting women entrepreneurs even more.
$1 million through the Women's Entrepreneurship Ecosystem Fund to provide targeted support to organizations dedicated to helping women business owners. In the coming weeks, this investment will help thousands of women entrepreneurs and business owners navigate through this crisis. It will give women tailored support through things like business workshops, mentorship, and skills training to help adapt to a digital marketplace. Je sais que c'est une période effrayante.
I know that this is a frightening time for many business leaders, especially women leaders.
About getting the support you need and about what comes next. So let me say this clearly. We're here for you, and our work is far from over. We're going to support you every step of the way through this. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Merci, Madame la Ministre. Exceptionally, today we're going to start in the room, Mackenzie, and then we'll go to the phone.
Hi, Minister. Hassan Mackenzie Gray from CTV News. On March 26th, the government closed all the Service Canada centres. Today in Ontario, I can go to the driving range, Home Depot, I can do many things. The province and many other provinces are opening back up. When will Service Canada centres be opened back up?
We took the decision to close the Service Canada centres as a result of an analysis on the importance of employee safety as well as the safety of our clients. However, that has not in any way impacted service. We have redeployed 3,000 staff members to better serve Canadians through COVID-19, and we have a 1,500 agent call center that is taking calls related to Service Canada. We're providing services to Canadians, and in terms of what happens next, you know that the government has issued the guidelines on April the 28th on the reopening. It's going to be gradual, and it'll be based on the professional health advice that we get from officials.
To be fair, Minister, I mean, grocery stores have been open this whole time. Many other businesses have had to retrofit during a period. Maybe they closed for a week or two, put up plexiglass, did other things. I mean, Service Canada is responsible for helping Canadians receive the benefits that they really need right now.
And that hasn't stopped.
Oh, I'm not debating that it's stopped, but I mean, many journalists, we get calls in our newsroom all the time from people who have limited access to the computer. Maybe they're on the phone and they would prefer to go in person. Why are these places not open now that we've had time to be able to retrofit these spaces and other services in the province are open?
So we made the decision based on the consideration of the safety of the employees, but also of our clients, Canadians who would visit these sites. However, the services are being supplied to Canadians. And in fact, we have redeployed staff to make sure that happens. In addition to that, for those who are not able to access the internet, we took proactive measures to not only scale up our ability to take phone calls, but we also went through our outreach and liaison officers and went through trusted community organizations to reach out to the most vulnerable, those who are not able to access the internet, to be able to ensure to them, to assure them that we have a number of means to allow them access to services, including individual agents who are walking people through applications when they are unable to fill them online or even access the phone lines. As I said, we will make those decisions based on the advice of our health officials.
Thank you, Minister. Does our friend from Global have a question? No? Okay. We'll now turn to the phone operator.
Thank you. Merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur l'étoile 1 si vous avez une question. La première question de Theresa Wright de la Canadian Press. The first question from Theresa Wright from the Canadian Press. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. This question is for Minister Ng. It's about the Air Canada layoffs. I'm sure that Air Canada and the public will be wondering if a bailout will be offered to this company. The Prime Minister didn't say yes to this, but he also didn't say no. When looking at this situation, is there a concern that offering a bailout for this company could open the floodgates?
I want to thank you for this question. And of course, of utmost concern is helping our companies and our workers through this very difficult time. And you know, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy is certainly there, available for companies to help keep their employees on staff. And we just announced just a few days ago a large enterprise. The acronym is LEAF, but the large enterprise facility that is going to provide as a last resort, funding support for those companies who may be looking for it. But the work will have to continue, and this period is a really challenging one for Canadian businesses, and that's why we've introduced the many emergency measures that we have to help businesses weather through this difficult period.
Theresa, follow-up?
Yes, thank you. My follow-up question is for Minister Monsef. A number of Indigenous women's organizations told the Commons Committee yesterday that money that has been given to shelters for COVID-19 aid is not reaching Indigenous women, particularly those living off reserve. What will you do to rectify this?
Thank you, Theresa. Minister Bennett and I were on a call with Indigenous leaders from various corners of the country yesterday. We have provided supports to Indigenous women's organizations on reserves, and we are planning on deploying further funds to strengthen the work of those who are working and doing really important work off reserves in urban centers. So more to come on that.
Thank you, Minister. Operator, prochaine question, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. The next question is from Raisa Patel from CBC. La prochaine question de Raisa Patel de CBC.
Hi there. My question is for Minister Ng. As we've heard, Air Canada plans to lay off more than half of its workforce. It did use the wage subsidy, and it would have had access to bridge loans. What does this latest update tell you about the effectiveness of these programs?
Well, I think that that this is absolutely a challenging time. We've certainly heard it from many businesses of all sizes across the country. And the measures that we have put out is indeed to help our businesses weather through this very difficult and challenging period. So whether it is to help them keep their employees through the wage subsidy or helping with lending products for the small businesses, but businesses indeed of all sizes, including large businesses like that of Air Canada. We know that sectors, particularly like tourism, have been particularly hard hit as a result of COVID-19. This is work that we are going to have to continue to do to support our workers and to support our Canadian companies through this very difficult time. And that work doesn't stop; it continues.
Follow up.
But regardless of these measures, Air Canada is still engaging in layoffs. Do you foresee some businesses not surviving this crisis regardless of government support?
Well, I think throughout this period, our focus has absolutely been on helping our Canadians, helping workers, helping businesses manage through this period. This period has been particularly difficult for some for some sectors, as I mentioned, in tourism. We're going to have to keep doing the work that we have been with Canadian businesses to weather through this period, so that we can come out of COVID-19.
Thank you, Minister. Seems like some of your colleagues are enjoying the long weekend. So, Mackenzie, back to you.
Mr. Ng, it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, generally that when a company of this size lays off this number of people, they have to inform the federal government that there are going to be layoffs of this size. Has Air Canada done that in this case, or did they give you a heads up prior to it becoming public?
Well, I'm not aware of that, but I would say that what is available to Air Canada, as well as companies of all sizes and in all sectors across the country, is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, where employers can indeed keep their employees on staff. And keeping employers and employees together is something that's really important. We want our workers to be supported. We also want to, make sure that companies are getting the help that they need through this time. We've also extended the wage subsidy support, so that will go until August, and we're going to have to keep doing the work to ensure that our companies of all sizes are supported through this difficult period.
And the Prime Minister have both mentioned the need for workers to stay with their companies. If federal funds are given to Air Canada, will it be on the condition, or any other business for that matter, that they rehire the employees that they have laid off?
Well, the conditions that we have put out, particularly for the wage subsidy, has to do with revenue decline. So if you're seeing revenue decline, you absolutely will get access to the wage subsidy. And in the large enterprise facility, there are conditions with respect to that facility that that ensures that Canadian taxpayers are indeed considered and in the course of those considerations.
My final question for you. Right now, if you have had a flight with Air Canada or any of the other airlines that has been canceled, they're not giving you a refund back. They're either giving you a credit or pushing your flight forward. With many of the airlines having major financial issues right now, do you think the Canadians should get their money back right now, or should they have confidence that these airlines will be around to actually honor their flights whenever we'll be out of this and planes will be able to take off?
Well, Air Canada has been and continues to be a good Canadian corporation, and we hope that Air Canada will treat its customers in the way that they always have, and I'm hopeful that they, of course, will ensure that they are serving their customers well.
Thank you, Minister. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. That's it for today. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, and that is the very short version of the federal briefing today. Public health officials were not there, and just a handful of cabinet ministers. It's a long weekend after all, so everybody deserves a little bit of time to recoup if they can before Tuesday. A lot of these people have been working really round the clock. The CBC's David Cochran's been listening in with us. Lots of attempts there to try and get the Minister of Small Business, Mary Ang, to say anything more about Air Canada. It certainly wouldn't be wise for her to do that, so she did not, nor was there any suggestion that the government would go a whole lot further in terms of trying to help Air Canada.
No, I think it's hard to get very specific answers on next steps from the government when the news of what is happening at Air Canada is less than 24 hours old. I mean, it was late last night, or after supper last night. I think Canadian Press was the first to break the story that this was coming. And there's a bunch of things still going on. I mean, Air Canada has to give official notice to the federal government. It's trying to negotiate some sort of workplace concessions and cost reductions with its employees to minimize the impact of any sort of workforce restructuring. These are things that all take time, and then it still has to see if it will negotiate with the government for some kind of bridge financing under the LEAF program, the Large Employer Emergency Fund, that was only announced this week, and is a negotiation of bridge financing and loans in excess of $60 million for these big companies on commercial terms with specific repayment and operational terms. So there's still a lot of dust to settle on the Air Canada situation right now, because it is in fact so new and also so seismic and significant. It's had a absolutely atrocious first quarter because of the pandemic. The second quarter promises to be even worse than the first, where they lost $1 billion and are hemorrhaging nearly $1 million an hour as they continue to operate. So there is going to be enormous pressure and calls upon the federal government to do something, though some members of the public will say don't help Air Canada. People who have tickets with them, who want refunds rather than just a credit. I think when you see the numbers coming out of Air Canada, you can see why they may not have the cash to do refunds to people who are keen to get them. But this is going to be a live issue in the virtual parliament next week when things get back there, as the government has to sit down and have a conversation with the corporate executives of Air Canada to see exactly what they can do. The Prime Minister pressed repeatedly, will there be a bailout? Will you do an equity stake? Will you cover their pension and benefit costs? No direct answers on that, but a promise to we'll see, which is really a very common answer in these times.
Yeah, and probably the government wants to see how this unfolds and whether they are going to need some sort of support. We had heard from an earlier guest that you're not really going to let Air Canada fail. I don't think that's something that the government would be keen on doing, but it might be too soon to say in what capacity they do more at this stage, because as I had said earlier, if you open the door to Air Canada, you risk opening the door to other kinds of bailouts of substantial size, although I understand Air Canada is sort of different in terms of how necessary it is to the functioning of the economy. All right.
Yeah, I mean, you've got empty planes, you've also got empty hotel chains right across the country, right? That is another industry with big financing costs and staffing costs that's not making any money, mostly because people aren't getting on the planes and going to a city, and it requires them to stay in a hotel. So just staggering and unprecedented challenges ahead for the economy, Rosie, with Air Canada being the first large industrial player to really put up the emergency signal flare in a profound way when dealing with its workforce.
Okay, David, thank you for your help with our coverage on this long weekend. Enjoy your long weekend. David's got an excellent piece up at cbc.ca/politics on how this goes forward. He tries to answer some of those questions, so go take a read of that. Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Our next guest helps run 2 women's shelters in Ontario, because we also heard about some additional funds for women's shelters today, as well as some information there from Miriam Montsev. Her shelter is one of those large number, 500, that have already received some funding, and she certainly does a plan on applying for more, given that $350 million will be available for these kinds of organizations starting on Tuesday. Jen Hutton is the Director of Women's Crisis Services of the Waterloo region, and she joins us from Kitchener. Jen, nice to see you.
Thanks, Rosie. Thanks for having me on.
We really appreciate it. We've done a couple stories here, my colleague Ashley Burke, about how incredibly difficult the situation is for people being abused right now, and how also the numbers have gone up. Can you give us a picture of what you've seen in your centers?
Well, we've actually seen some of our numbers decline a bit. We run at about 90% capacity, and lately, since the pandemic, we've had about 40, 50, 60% capacity. So we're not seeing as many women reach out to us. They're also not calling our support line in the same numbers that they would have previously.
And Minister Montsev spoke to that and has spoken to it, and that is not because it's not happening. That is because people, So tell me what's going on there. It's not that there are fewer people in these, terrible times undergoing stress. What is actually happening?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think women are safe to reach out. They're just not having the opportunity that they would have previously when their abusive partner would go out into the community, out for work, whatever that may look like. So we actually recently, we did it within a matter of a couple days, that we added an online chat feature, because we really wanted to make sure women could reach us that need to. And we actually had a family come in just in the last couple days, and she said to us that if we didn't have that chat feature, she might not have gotten to safety. So that was good news for us. But there's a lot of worry that domestic violence is actually increasing right now, but our numbers are decreasing. So I just don't think it's safe for them to reach out. And I think it's hard for them to plan ahead and make such a major move when there's so much uncertainty happening right now.
For sure, whether it be economic uncertainty or health uncertainty, and then these people are of course stuck in their homes with the abuser as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And so what you've received some support from Ottawa. What else could you, if you were going to get more money, what else could you do to try and adapt your services to the situation we're in now?
Yeah, we're really looking ahead, because we're all predicting that once things start to open up, we'll see an increased demand for our services. So we're looking ahead how to plan for that potential demand increase and how we can reach women sooner. We're always looking at how do we shift our efforts to be a bit more upstream and a bit more preventative in nature. So any money will help us in that regard, knowing that right now we're seeing our costs go up because of managing the pandemic in the shelter, and then also seeing fundraising revenue decrease because we're having to cancel some of our major events.
Yeah, for sure. I'll just leave it with this. If you were going to say, if there was someone watching right now who was in this situation and very worried and frightened and not sure what to do, what would you say to them?
Well, I wouldn't want them to feel alone, and I would want them to find a safe way to reach out for help, to make sure that they get some guidance if they are thinking of leaving, because we know that's the highest risk time for women. And I also really say to family, friends, and neighbors, look out for one another, because we know it's maybe not safe for a woman to reach out. So we're also really relying on those around them to help them take care and to call for help if needed.
Yeah, such an important message. Jen Hutton, thank you very much for making the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too. That's Jen Hutton, Director of the Women's Crisis Services of the Waterloo Region. All right, so the government's announcements today really about reiterating some of the measures that they've already taken, but reminding you that Canada Child Benefit, that one-time additional payment of $300 is available, and confirming that as it has since the government put it into place, that child benefit will in fact go up. Lots of comments, though, too, on the layoff of potentially 20,000 people at Air Canada, with the government, the Prime Minister specifically, not saying more about a potential bailout, given the numbers of programs already available to Air Canada, but knowing that this may be something they have to contemplate down the road. I'm Rosemary Barton. The Prime Minister is taking a couple days off this weekend, so I will too. Michael Serapio continues our coverage here on CBC News Network right after this short break. Thank you for watching. Take good care.